Welcome to Being Humans Together. I'm Ian Christopher Wendt. Gathering knowledge from diverse perspectives and sources enriches our minds and hearts, gives us more complex tools to understand our modern and increasingly global societies, and provides us with more robust and healthier abilities to respond to challenges. How do we know what is real? How do we know what is true? How do we balance the differing worldviews and approaches to knowing that shape each of our worlds and the larger world we share together? One of the core issues of this set of episodes of Being Humans Together is how we understand the world scientifically, philosophically, socially, and religiously. In this episode, we will lay out 3 ways we know things, or 3 methods of epistemology. They are arguments from authority, the scientific method of inductive reasoning, and knowledge passed to us relationally or socially. Next, we'll consider some historical examples of the tension between scientific and religious ways of knowing, including a more complex view of Galileo than you may have heard. Finally, I'll tell you a personal story about balancing religion and biological evolution. Our goal is to give you more perspective on the inevitable struggle we all must engage in to piece together meaning from multiple approaches and forms of knowledge. Because in the end, none of them is complete alone. In previous episodes, we've engaged with physics theories about the composition and development of the universe. We also devoted a long episode to exploring the historical evolution of human consciousness that built on a variety of historical, archaeological, evolutionary, linguistic, as well as cultural, religious, and mythological perspectives. On Being Humans Together, my methodology and worldview embraces and integrates different scientific and social scientific approaches with cultural, philosophical, and religious perspectives to understand the experience of being humans. Balancing these perspectives is something we all need to do in our own ways. You don't need to accept my views, perspectives, or arguments in whole to gain some value from our time together. Indeed, I presume that you'll find some aspects of our approach more relevant and useful to you than other aspects. In broad terms, there are 3 major approaches to knowing or epistemology that shape most of what you know. First, arguments from authority. Most religious precepts and beliefs are based on authoritative sources. The Word of God, scriptures, the teachings of prophets, apostles, gurus, saints, ancient church fathers, and more recent church leaders. Many political arguments are also arguments based on authority. You make an argument, quote the major political figures that established or believed or substantiated the major aspects of that idea, philosophy, or policy, and apply that philosophical perspective or approach to contemporary political or economic circumstances and problems. Even many quasi-scientific controversies often boil down to arguments based on authority. The science is settled. 97% of scientists agree that, fill in the blank. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend our brand. The challenge is that the actual controversy is usually not essentially about science, but is instead about the application of public policy, about spending tax money on certain actions related to nature or society. Science doesn't explain how much government revenue should be spent on a given regulation or policy. The most obvious flaw on knowing things based on authoritative sources is that our authoritative sources are usually, well, pretty much always, shaped by human beings from the past. All human beings have limited viewpoints. As time passes, we find flaws in the sources, and we struggle to apply and reapply those sources meaningfully to new circumstances, changing social arrangements, and more contemporary philosophical worldviews. The second approach to knowing the world is through arguments built on the scientific method of inductive reasoning. This method is built on our ability to understand the world based on our senses and our mental effort. Let's start by recognizing that this isn't as easy or obvious as it might sound. Our senses are sometimes wrong. They're certainly limited. Our memories are faulty. Our ability to think rationally is limited. Furthermore, our personal sense observations alone are not sufficient to provide us with knowledge of very small things like cells, or very distant things like stars or galaxies. Nevertheless, in the powerful scientific method which has thoroughly reshaped the modern world, scientists use observations and data gathered in controlled experiments to support or reject hypotheses and eventually to draw more general conclusions about how the world functions. The efficacy of this method is constantly demonstrated to us in our technologies, our medicines, and the never-ending array of new stuff corporations make and sell us. This method is also fundamentally built on the foundation of mathematics, logic, and deductive reasoning. These are powerful and effective tools. But these tools and approaches to knowing don't answer all questions, solve all problems, or even address key issues like meaning, beauty, spirit, or death. Moreover, as we discussed in the last episode, contemporary physics shows us a great deal of uncertainty, indeterminacy, boundaries of our knowledge, black holes in our vision, and massive swaths of the universe that are dark. And the embrace of the scientific method, inductive reasoning, mathematics, and deductive reasoning do not stop scientists and other people generally from embracing unprovable philosophical and even somewhat religious ideas about the multiverse, nine-dimensional space, wormholes, or a climate apocalypse. The third approach to knowing is through consensus and agreement with the people who matter to us. In a previous episode, I argued that almost all knowledge or epistemology is in fact relational. We know things because every piece of knowledge that we learn has been passed to us by our nurturers, caregivers, personal authorities, and other sources of knowledge that have been trained and educated into our minds through teachers, schools, books, videos, movies, memes, news, our culture, our communities, and powerful institutions. Think about it. What do you actually know that you discovered for yourself, by yourself? Most of what you know was taught to you by people you know. Then, as you became educated and mature enough, you learned more by drawing information and knowledge from published sources of information. When you Google something and the AI throws up a summary, it is just combining words by humans that the internet suggests are authoritative on the matter. You may protest that in each of our specific areas of expertise and experience, we produce new knowledge and discoveries. True. But this is pretty rare. Experts know a lot of stuff, a lot more stuff than they could ever claim to have innovated or invented. They learn so much knowledge and expertise in order to be able to approach the cutting edge, where they can do something original. Indeed, most of what experts do is synthesize, reinterpret, and slightly advance existing knowledge. And then they teach the synthesized knowledge of their field. So how do we evaluate, integrate, or choose between these ways of knowledge when these approaches differ? When religious authorities, experts and scientists, politicians and political pundits, and your loud uncle at Thanksgiving disagree? This is not a new problem. Almost 1,000 years ago, Al-Ghazali and Thomas Aquinas each struggled with the relationship between faith and reason, or religion and science, or authority and rationality, to explain the nature of reality. They each engaged with philosophical ideas as well as authoritative religious texts and beliefs, attempting to balance them. Al-Ghazali criticized the limitations of reason in comprehending divine reality, and he stressed the importance of mystical experience. Aquinas emphasized the harmony between reason and faith, and believed that reason could illuminate religious truths. Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and Buddhist philosophers have all considered these issues. More recently, and more famously, Galileo came into conflict with the Catholic Inquisition about the heliocentric theory that the Earth was not the center of the universe and that it moves around the sun. Permit me to tell you a little more of the story than you may know. You probably have heard that Galileo used telescopes and astronomical observations to support Copernicus's theory that the sun was the center of the universe, not the Earth. You've also probably heard that dogmatic leaders of the Catholic Church threatened Galileo, that great man of science, with torture and possible death to crush his obviously accurate ideas. Stupid religious zealots. But that's not accurate. Galileo was arrogant, argumentative, and he could not substantiate his ideas with sufficient evidence to demonstrate his arguments. His opponents were not unscientific idiots. They had observations, philosophical arguments, and authoritative sources of their own. He refused to compromise, and he was finally unable to demonstrate that the Earth moved. And so, to avoid painful consequences, he backed down. The crux of the issue came down to the geometric principle of parallax. Anyone that moves will observe changes in the orientation of other objects relative to one another as they move, especially objects that are closer and further away from the moving observer. For example, my fingers. As I move from right to left, the orientation of my fingers shifts. When I move my head to my left, the finger closest to me appears to be on my right. When I move my head to the right, the finger closest to me appears to be on my left. Galileo was arguing that the Earth moved around the sun. Even in the early 1600s, they understood that such motion had to be millions of miles, right? In fact, the diameter of the Earth's orbit is 186 million miles, or 300 million kilometers. So Galileo's philosophical, scientific, and religious opponents challenged him, asking, if we are in fact moving millions of miles each year back and forth from side to side of the sun, why don't the stars move in parallax? In their day, neither Galileo nor anyone else could answer that question. Now we know the answers. First, with very accurate astronomical measurements, we can identify slight parallax between stars in our neighborhood of the Milky Way as we orbit the sun. But in the 1600s, their telescopes could not observe that motion. But most importantly, the stars are so much further away than Galileo or anyone else in that time could have guessed, millions of times further away. If I pace back and forth across the street, I can see parallax in my neighborhood, but I can't see parallax on the distant horizon. That was the problem. It wasn't that the scholars of Galileo's day were all dogmatic idiots. It was that Galileo lacked the scientific instruments and information to prove that the Earth orbited the sun, and so he had to back down. Can we also recognize one more obvious point? It wasn't that Galileo and Copernicus were right about heliocentrism and everyone else was ignorant and wrong about geocentrism. They were all wrong. The Earth isn't the center of the universe. Neither is the sun the center of the universe. Neither is the Milky Way the center of the universe. Everything seems to be in motion, and the idea that the universe has any observable center at all is now rejected by physicists. Our point here is that we often make broad generalizations about the tensions between science, religion, reason, and faith. But those generalizations are often inaccurate to the point of being propaganda. Human beings have been struggling to find balance between reason and faith for more than 1,000 years. And in our day, we need to continue to do so. Gathering lots of knowledge, comparing different perspectives, and being open to useful compromises is an effective strategy in every human endeavor. Finally, I'd like to tell you a much more personal story of the struggle to understand who we are as human beings, specifically the tension between Christianity and the theory of evolution. I'm a practicing Christian, yet my church background is heterodox, which has placed me outside of the religious mainstream all of my life. I'm a Latter-day Saint or Mormon, or a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If I were a Lutheran or Catholic or an evangelical Protestant Christian or Orthodox Christian, I could claim a pretty uncomplicated relationship with the Christian body of believers. But I can't, and I won't pretend to. Many Christians find our beliefs not only unorthodox, but preposterous, offensive. I'm not going to engage with any of that today. I'm just admitting that my story today is about the relationship between biology, science, and Christian religion from my personal background. I hope you can see that these experiences and ideas actually have a lot in common with other religious people, Christians and otherwise. Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. Redefining biological sciences and challenging many ways of understanding who human beings are. Christian leaders, scholars, and believers of all kinds have struggled with the ideas of the theory of evolution ever since. In the early 1900s, 3 prominent leaders of my church held differing opinions on biological evolution and creation. None of them argued that human beings evolved from other species. They all thought that the scriptures make it clear that God made Adam in his image. But they had differing viewpoints about the age of the earth, the possibility that species had evolved prior to human creation, and the fundamental way that a believer could embrace scientific knowledge. This is a story my father told me numerous times as I grew up. It was very important to him and his understanding of ways that we know things. When my dad was a kid growing up in New York City in the 1950s and 1960s, most Christians in our congregations rejected evolutionary biology, which made it challenging to take science classes in public school. The kind of advice my dad got was, learn what you need to for the exams, but know that it's false, and then forget it. That always bothered him. He wanted a world that made sense, that could be reasoned out. He wanted his faith and his reason to combine into something greater, some kind of coherent whole. It troubled him that things that he learned in science in school that helped him understand the world were rejected by his fellow Christian believers. When he was 18 years old, my father went to a church university, Brigham Young University. They taught biology there, including the theory of evolution. They still do. My father went to the library to try to understand if he could try to reconcile science and evolution with God's creation of the universe. There he found the sources and learned this history. In the early 1900s, 3 prominent leaders of my church held differing opinions on evolution and creation. They were named Joseph Fielding Smith, a grandnephew of Joseph Smith, B.H. Roberts, and James Talmage. The 3 men differed publicly about whether the world was much older than biblical creation suggests, and whether there was any death or change in species prior to the creation of Adam. Roberts and Talmage were both noted LDS theologians who had been trained in the sciences. They both expressed the idea that God may have used scientific laws and principles, such as evolution, to create the variety of plant and animal species on Earth prior to the creation of Adam. They both accepted the evidence from geology and biology that the Earth is much older than the Genesis account suggests. In general, their views embraced the principle that all truths will eventually form a unity if we apply our minds and our faith together. Smith was squarely opposed to the idea of evolution, and he expressed that conclusion publicly. During the 1930s, Roberts and Smith both wrote manuscript books exploring the relationship between divine creation and scientific evolution. Smith rejected evolution. Roberts tried to accommodate it within a Christian framework. The leader of the church found this public debate disruptive and told both men to keep their views private. The official position of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on creation was that God created the earth, that God created humanity in his image, and that God has not revealed the methods used to create the earth and the universe. That is still the official position of our church. In 1953, after the previous leader of the church and Talmage and Roberts had all died, Joseph Fielding Smith published his manuscript entitled Man, His Origin and Destiny, in which he strongly argued that the theory of evolution was false. Later, his son-in-law, a leading church theologian, published his own book called Mormon Doctrine, in which he also rejected evolutionary biology as heresy. My father grew up in this context where many Latter-day Saints read those books and concluded that they could not be both believing Christians and accept evolutionary biology. Maybe you've heard some of the same arguments yourself. When my father learned this history, when he learned that a variety of respected church leaders, including others I haven't named, had worked to understand the relationships between science and faith in order to comprehend a universe of laws, and that furthermore, the official position of the church was that we don't know how God created the universe, he cried in the library. He was overjoyed that he could pursue a balance of scientific and religious methods for understanding the world. And furthermore, that his church embraced and supported the unity of knowledge and truth, notwithstanding what many common members said or believed. And then he lived his life in an effort to apply all of the tools of science, reason, faith, philosophy, and scripture to make sense of the world. It was important to him. He passed it along to his children. My mother held similar principles and taught them to us as well. I went to BYU in the 1990s myself. I had many of the same experiences my parents did with Christian congregants who were very much opposed to evolutionary biology. The first professor I got close to at BYU was my biology professor, Dr. Peterson. In addition to biology, I took an honors epistemology class from him on the complex relationships between ways of knowing, including science, philosophy, and religion. In that class, we reinforced and expanded on the history my father had learned. Professor Peterson even gave me my first opportunity to be a teaching assistant for introductory biology before I went off to study to be a historian. As I said in the introduction today, I try to utilize as many sources of knowledge, wisdom, technology, and truth as I can. I try to believe everything that I find to be true, including things that are true enough and effective and useful for living well. When I was younger, it was important to me to make the pieces fit together as neatly as possible. It was important to me to reconcile all of the differences and contradictions between faith and reason, for example. As I've lived longer and gotten beat up by life a few times, I've become humbler, and I've let go of the conviction that I'm capable of resolving every contradiction. So it has become easier for me to be both accepting of many different principles, theories, ideas, and truths, and to be critical of all of them, even if I cannot make them all fit together neatly. I am a Christian believer. I accept the resurrection and atonement of Jesus Christ for me and for all people. I'm not really an orthodox anything. I'm also very much a humanist. I'm convinced that humanity and consciousness are special in the universe, and that we share so much more than the distinctions that we use to divide ourselves into nations, races, identity groups, classes, ethnicities, cultures, etc. My study of history, social science, philosophy, and world religions leads me to identify a range of shared principles that bind us together as human beings across societies and cultures. I'm a historian, scholar, and teacher. Historians are particularists more than advocates for big theories. We study specific times and places. I have primarily been a student of Asian and Middle Eastern societies during the period that their flourishing economies and states were transformed by the rise of modernity. If you ask a historian a question, their answer will usually be, it's more complicated. We like to gather as much detail and evidence as we can find and then put the pieces together. I've been shaped by many other ideas, philosophies, and experiences. Those certainly include many ideas and principles from physics and biological science. I try to balance and put the pieces together with some humility. I try to maintain an open mind, and as I find new information, I try to learn and modify my perspectives and behaviors. Let me give one more example of how I've altered my understanding of evolutionary biology. I've shared the principles of biological evolution as they have shaped human history in a variety of circumstances over my career as a scholar and historian. Darwin's ideas had a profound influence on modern society, including the rise of modern biological sciences, from genetics to modern medicine, as well as less laudable effects such as the rise of scientific racism, various justifications for imperialism, increased nationalism, and social Darwinism. I don't blame Darwin for all of the applications and misapplications of his ideas. I simply point out that even historians have reason to understand and teach evolutionary biology. In that context, I've accepted the basic outlines of evolutionary theory, that genetic variations and mutations across populations, along with natural selection over time, lead to changes in genetic and phenotypical expressions among groups of animals. Those changes, especially in circumstances of disruption, lead to evolution. I understand the examples of Galapagos finches, moths in industrializing cities, and many more. But more recently, I've come across a fundamental critique of evolutionary biology that addresses a question I've long held, that comes from the realm of information theory. Basically, it is this: if you randomly alter information, which has structure and functionality, that information quickly devolves into chaotic randomness, not increased complexity and functionality of information. This applies to computer code, DNA, and many other forms of information. Have you ever tried to code a computer program? What happens if you make a mistake in one line? Have you ever spent an hour trying to find a single error in a code you wrote? The program will not run. If it does manage to run, it will produce errors. What if you were to randomly introduce new letters or numbers to the sequence of your program? What if you continually mutated your program? Would you randomly produce a conscious AI? Would your program be transformed into something new and superior? No. It would become a broken program. Then it would become a random set of letters and numbers, and eventually it would become random noise, like static. What would happen if you randomly altered the code in the autopilot system on an airplane? Would it become a fighter pilot? Or perhaps a video game? No, it would crash and kill all of the people on board long before it evolved. This applies equally to DNA. Random mutation alone is not a functional or convincing mechanism for producing the variety of species we observe on the Earth. Evolutionary biology is powerful, and I've devoted much time and effort to balancing my understanding of biosciences with my understanding of human histories, cultures, and religions. But I've also come to add a fundamental question mark to the mechanisms of evolutionary theory. And so I continue to add new information to my understanding. Science has fundamental boundaries. Science is not the pursuit of truth. It is an effort to accurately describe the world and the universe through inquiry, observation, experimentation, and the development of hypotheses and theories. It is powerful and useful for the production of machines, technologies, and tools. There are other purposes and ends in life that also matter. Science alone does not provide meaning, purpose, beauty, or long-term connective bonds that hold families and communities together. At the same time, many people find religious perspectives and arguments from authority confining or lacking in relevance to the modern world. And so we all must balance science, religion, diverse cultures, reason, and faith. If this is meaningful to you, if it helps you find balance in your approach to understanding the universe, please connect and share with your people, your friends, your family, and please join us. Like, subscribe, comment, share. Participate and support our community. Amen, amen. This is the way of being humans together.